Hi there everyone, I'm Alex. Welcome back to Drummer Artificer Studios. Today we're going to do something a little bit different and we're going to work with some metal. So if you've seen some of my videos in the past, you'll know that a large portion of what's on this channel is costuming, cosplay, and prop work. That is a large portion of what I do as my hobby, as my fun stuff to occupy my time and keep me sane. But it is not what I originally intended to have Drummer Artificer Studios be. I look around and I see all these places where people can go and spend time to paint and learn to draw and work with clay and stuff like that. But I saw there weren't many places for you to go and work with metal. And that is actually what my preferred medium is. I have a Master's of Fine Arts in Metalsmithing from Wayne State. So I decided that I would go ahead and start a new series of videos for this channel where I'm actually going to be covering the demos I gave my Intro to Jewelry students at Wayne State. So each video will cover a different topic of the very basics of metalsmithing and jewelry design. So for this first video, we're going to cover piercing. Now when I say piercing, what I'm referring to is cutting through plate metal using a jeweler's saw. A jeweler's saw is a small handsaw that looks like this. It is very similar to a coping saw for woodworking. The main difference is this set screw right here allows you to change the throat length and put tension into the blade, and it makes it so you can use smaller and longer blades. Now, you look at this, there actually is a blade currently in this saw. You can see how fine that blade is. It's tiny. But this is what you use for cutting through metal. There are numerous different sizes of blades, all based off of what thickness of metal you're going to be using. Down in the description for this video, you will find a link for a handy, nifty, difty handout that I've put together. That's weird. So I've put together a handout that just covers the basics of how to adjust the frame to make sure you have the correct tension and how to select blades. On the bottom, there are two sample pieces for you to cut out and work on. One of them is just a simple series of lines that are both straight and squiggled. This is so that you can get used to how to use the blade, how to use the saw, make sure you get nice clean cuts, get straight lines, and get some control on how to use the saw as you go. The other one are a series of 3 letters, E, M, and H. These letters are going to come into play in a later demo. So I like using this as a starting one to get you used to using the saw, but then they also work later on because we're going to use these so to identify the different types of solder that we're going to use when we start soldering. So let's go over the parts of the jeweler's saw. This here is obviously called the handle. This, the distance between these two set screws, is the throat. That's where you actually put the blade, as you can see there. The set screw in the back is the length adjustment screw, and then you've got the bottom and top set screws and jaws. The jaws is this small plate here that's adjustable that you clamp the ends of the blade into. That's what holds it in place. A coping saw, there's a little pin that goes through the blade and it hooks in place. This is purely held in by you clamping it tight. There are different sizes of jeweler's saws. This one is a 3-inch saw. It's what I primarily use. I also have a 6-inch saw, or it's probably more about a 5-inch saw. But they have the different lengths so that your depth of the saw is different. Because if you're working on a big sheet of metal, this isn't going to be able to reach into the middle. So I've seen people that have modified saws and they took a 5-inch depth jeweler's saw and welded in an extra foot of metal so they can get really deep into a large plate of metal. But for most little things, that pins and buckles and rings and stuff like that, this is probably all you're going to need. I'll supply links in the description of some places that you can find the different sizes of jeweler's saw and where you can find the blades. So when setting this, the first thing I always tell people to do, now there are multiple ways that people will set these. What I have found works best for me is I start by clamping the blade into the bottom set screw and jaw plate. You just put the blade in there and tighten it down so it's nice and firm and won't come out. Now, these saws cut on the downward pull, so you need to make sure that the teeth are positioned towards the outside of the saw frame and are going in the downward direction, because you're going to be cutting like that. My next step usually is to adjust the length, and I adjust it so that the other end of the blade is about halfway into the jaw. You do that because you're going to end up putting tension on it, and you need the space for you to be able to flex the frame so you can pinch the blade in there. Now, once you have your frame set, for probably 98% of the time, you will never have to readjust this unless you're going to be using a blade that's already been broken. Because as these blades break, they break in different spots. You can actually change the length of this to make it so you can continue to use a broken blade. As long as there's enough cutting length in the blade, you can keep using it. But once you get it set for a full unused blade, you usually don't have to change this. So now that I have it clamped in the bottom, I've got it at the right length, because it's about halfway through there. I'm going to brace it up against my workbench and push in slightly, making sure that the end of the blade is between the jaws. I'm pushing in, and that is creating the tension. I then tighten it down, and when I push on it, it should flex, but not all that much. You don't want it bowing in like half an inch or something. That is too loose. The best way I have found to determine if you have the proper tension on this is to pluck it like a guitar string. If you can get that nice twang of a string there, then you know you have the right tension on this. So when it comes to selecting what blade you're going to be using for whatever you're cutting, on the handout, I've included a chart. It lists the blade size, how many teeth per inch, the B&S gauge, which a B&S gauge is the tool you use to determine how thick your metal is. So a B&S gauge just refers to the thickness of your metal. And then what drill bit you should use. Those are the things that are on this chart. I tend to use a 2-0 saw blade. I just like it because it gives a nice, precise, fine cut, and it works for most standard thicknesses that metalsmiths will use. To explain a little bit on the blades, is you'll see that they run at the top, it's got an 8-0, and at the bottom it has an 8. The larger the number, meaning 1 to 8, is going to be a larger tooth. It's going to be a bigger blade. It's made for thicker material. You get up into the 4 to 8, and you're pretty much using a woodworking saw blade. That's how large they get. The smaller the numbers, 0, 2-0, 3-0, 4-0, so on down, means it's getting smaller and smaller. It's for thinner stock, but the smaller it gets, it also means the more precise it's going to be. You're going to be able to get a smoother cut. It might take longer, but it's going to be a smoother cut, and you'll have less finishing work to do. So the 2-0 is made for 20 to 22 gauge metal, or at least that's what they recommend it for. I tend to use it for anything from 16 to 22 gauge metal. It just makes it so I don't have to keep bouncing back and forth in saw blades. I can just buy one size and I'm good, because that's about the only size metal I work with. If I work with anything larger than that, I'm probably cutting it on a bandsaw or something anyway. But that's all included right here on the chart. You can also find all sorts of information like that on the internet, and generally any supply site that you're going to buy stuff from will have their own version of this chart right on their website to help you select what blades you need. And if you have a supply house that you go to locally in the Detroit area, I like going to C.R. Hill in Berkeley. They can help you determine what size blade you need to get. All you have to do is tell them how thick your metal is going to be, and they will tell you what you need to buy. When you buy them, they will come in usually a little pouch. It will look something like this. It may vary, but it's generally some form of a small pouch. And inside that pouch, there's going to be some form of a plastic sleeve filled with bundles. Now, each one of these bundles holds a gross of blades, which means there's 12 blades in each of these little bundles. So you get an idea of just how small all of these things are, in that there are 12 blades in that. So you have your saw frame adjusted. You've got your sample design that you're going to cut out your images on. You need to start cutting your metal. First thing you have to do is you have to attach this to your metal plate. Now, there are two primary ways that I see people doing it. I've used both, and they both work great. One is going to be to use rubber cement. You just brush the rubber cement on here, slap onto your piece, and it adheres almost instantly. And when you peel it off, there's virtually no cleanup. You might have to rub the metal a little bit to get a little bit of the residue off, but it works great. The other way that I learned back in high school that also works great is to use double-sided Scotch tape. I tend to use the permanent double-sided Scotch tape. It's the yellow package, but it's not permanent. It's generally considered permanent if you're putting it on paper. Because we're putting it on the metal, it will peel off very easily, and it makes it go very quickly when putting the design onto your metal. So when putting it on, I've got my metal, I've got my piece of paper. I'm going to take strips of my double-sided tape. And what I like about the Scotch double-sided tape is it does not have a paper backing. Because a lot of times double-sided tape will have some form of a backing on it that you have to peel off the other side. This stuff doesn't. So it goes a little bit quicker when putting everything together. So I've now got two strips of the double-sided tape covering the entire back of my piece. All I'm going to do is line it up on one end, so it's nice and square, and lay it out. That simple. Our piece is now stuck onto the metal. So when I start cutting this, I'm just going to come from the outside, cut straight through, and hit the letters. But a step I tend to do, especially with this sample, before I start doing that, is I punch holes in it. These are going to end up being hung from little pieces of wire, the solder that we're going to use in our soldering. So to be able to hang them, we have to punch a hole somewhere on the letter. That will be on the interior of the letter. So we have to drill a hole going through this. If you've got a metal hole punch, that will work. But a lot of people don't have that kind of a tool. I don't even have that tool yet. So we have to drill a hole. To start drilling the hole, I'm going to use the center punch. Now this is just a spring-loaded center punch that you can buy at pretty much any hardware store. You can also use a simple hammer center punch. Either one work. I just like using this because it means there's fewer tools I have to pull out each time I do it. So all I'm going to do is I tend to put them in the top left-hand corner of each letter. That easy, and our center punches are in. That's why I love these spring-loaded center punches. So now we've got to drill the hole. On your workbench, I haven't covered this yet, but this is called a bench pin. This is what we're going to be cutting on. You can see there are a few holes in it, and a lot of people will just drill right into this bench pin, and that's absolutely fine, because a lot of times smiths will make their own. This one came with my portable jewelry bench, so I don't want to ruin it yet. So I've got a spare piece of wood. That's simple. Just a cutoff of 2x4. I'm going to put my design on it, and now when I drill holes, I'm drilling into the 2x4 instead of my workbench. So I've got a small drill bit clamped into my drill. I'm going to hold the piece down with one hand and just drill. I'm pretty much just letting the weight of the drill do the work for me. And I'm pausing every now and then so that I don't heat up the bit too much while trying to cut through the metal. And now all 3 of the holes are drilled. So we've got everything ready, and we're ready to start cutting our piece. So that is going to be done here on the bench pin. And you'll see that there is a V-shaped cut going through the front of the bench pin. I'll pull it out so we can get a better look at it. So we've got this V-shaped cut with a bigger hole right at the peak of the V. That V is so that we can brace our metal right over it and hold it, but have nothing underneath to get in the way of the blade. You don't have to go all the way over the hole. You can work anywhere on it, but with your non-cutting hand, so since I'm right-handed, I will be holding it up here with my left hand, you will kind of pinch the metal onto the bench pin, and then using your cutting hand, you're going to hold your saw frame. You don't want a death grip on this saw. It's not going to do anything but make you break a lot of blades. You want a firm grip so it doesn't move out of your hand, but you also want a very light grip. I tend to pinch the top of it between my thumb and index finger and then loosely hold it with my other fingers. I find that's what gives me the best control over this. You also, as you're cutting, don't want to really force it forward. You're pretty much just letting gravity pull your arm down as you cut. You will also notice the height of my bench. Generally, jewelers want to have their work surface as close to eye level as possible. It makes it so that you're not trying to reach under a table and leaning over your piece. You want it pretty much at eye level. I could have stood to make this bench slightly taller when I built it, but I also tend to hunch a bit when I work so that I get closer to it. So this is a pretty optimum height for me. But when I start cutting into the piece generally, I'll start by putting the saw at a slight angle, and that will allow me to pull it a little bit better just to put a small groove into the piece that the blade can then follow through. So I'll start over here on the E. I try to line it up with one of the edges. I've now got my groove started. And you can see I'm going very slowly and very smoothly. I'm not really putting any forward force. I'm just moving the saw up and down. And you can see as I'm going, I'm breathing on it to try and clear off some of the dust. Now, if you really get into doing this and you've got a permanent setup, I know jewelers that actually have a dust collector set up underneath or right in front of their bench pin, and it makes it so all of those filings get sucked right up into the dust collector so they don't have to worry about doing that. So we've started cutting, and now look at that. We are at a corner. So how exactly are we going to handle cutting around a corner? Fortunately, these blades are so small that what you can actually do is almost create a three-point turn. You keep it steady in one position, and you move it up and down. So, fortunately here, we see it. I've just run into a bit of an issue. This depth of frame is not deep enough for me to cut straight through. So, this is another thing that you can do, if you so choose, is I will just cut straight through and lop the E off the rest of the metal. Okay, so nice, slow, smooth cutting, and we now have our E separated from the rest of our piece. So now I'll come in and cut these interior sections on the E. I will do that same thing of start at a slight angle just to get it going. And you can see it will skip a little bit. That's part of why I do it at the angle, so that there's a smaller piece for me to cut into. And there we go. We are now cutting. So here I am. I'm at a corner again. To handle this corner, I'm basically going to keep the blade in one position, and I'm just going to move it up and down while turning it. And that will allow me to basically file the hole it's in slightly larger and make it so I can turn the blade all the way 90 degrees. I can now keep following my line until I reach my next corner and have to do it again. So again, I turn the piece 90 degrees, keep it stationary, there we go. And just that easily, we now have one of the interior segments of the E cut out. So I'm going to repeat that process for the rest of it, and then we'll see what it looks like when it's done. So there it was. I was finishing to cut through here. I started to go a little too quick. Can't see because of the cars. Snap that blade. So now the top portion I couldn't use. If I so wanted, I could adjust this down to use this bottom portion, but it would mean I'd only have about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of cut depth, and that's not really worth it, so I'm just going to put a brand new blade in here, get back to work. So now that it's broken, and it broke part of the way through the cut, I have to actually go and re-follow the path I took to get back to where I was. So, I've gone through and I now have my 3 letters all cut out and ready to go for the next demo. You will be left over in some form a whole bunch of little scraps of metal. You can throw these away. You might be able to save them for like this one. There's a nice larger piece there. I could use that for another piece. I tend to save all my scrap. I will put it into different bins based off of if it's brass, if it's copper, if it's silver, if it's pewter, whatever. Because I can go through and remelt this using an ingot and put it together as a fresh big block, and then I can either roll it out or turn it into new sheet, or I can make a piece out of it that's thicker, like a belt buckle, or I can go through and just reuse it to cast with. So there's all sorts of different things you can do with the scraps. So don't ever just throw this stuff away. You'll be able to use it. Now, something we didn't cover with these letters is occasionally you will have a piece where you need to be able to cut something on the interior of the design. That's part of what this sample is for. I've gone ahead and drilled a hole at the end of one of these lines. Say you had a design that you've already cut your general shape out and you wanted to cut something on the inside out without cutting straight through the side wall. You have to drill a hole somewhere in your design where it won't mess up the design. But now you've got to get your saw in there without cutting through it. How do you do that? You take your frame, you unclamp the top jaw so that it's loose again, as if you just put a new blade in it. You then take your design and thread your blade through your hole. Make sure it's sitting up against the bottom jaw, and now you clamp your blade in. Now, your blade is on the interior of your piece without having gone through the intervening wall. From here, you can just work as normal. Whenever you get done with your design and back to that starting point, to take it off, you just do the reverse. You unclamp and just pull it right out. And that's how you'll do the interior of a piece. So those are pretty much all the basics of how to work with a jeweler's saw frame. I might do more videos where I go some more in-depth on doing some detail work on some of my personal pieces I do, and I'll show you how I get some of the interior cuts and everything in those. But those are pretty much the basics of how to do it. So as I said in a later video, and actually I think 2 later videos probably, these little letters will come back into play. So if you want to give that a try, follow the links I have down in the description for where to find the tools and to get this handout so that you can get the sample designs and try to work some metal of your own. So, hopefully you learned something from this. I'm Alex. You've been watching Drummer Artificer Studios. See you next time. I lost a giant package of blades. Joy.